The honourable member for Cowichan Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This evening I am looking for something simple from the Parliamentary Secretary. I would like a clear yes or no on whether the government will support my bill C-279 to limit the length of federal elections. I would like to lay out the reasons for the government to support the bill. The Parliamentary Secretary has stated his desire to work with me on undoing many of the changes that happened in the Unfair Elections Act and specifically look at the length of elections. You can look at his question period response to see that. For each day, Mr. Speaker, that a campaign lasts longer than 37 days, a political party can spend more money. This means that a party's national campaign had the ability to spend $675,000 a day for every day that it went over 37 days. So, political parties can cynically lengthen campaign periods to outspend their opponents. And I would argue that this is exactly what happened in the 2015 election. This spending means it hurts smaller parties as they do not have the funds to spend that kind of money. In making an election fairer, we cannot help just the richest political parties gain an advantage. And it is not just political parties spending the money that is the issue, but the general taxpayer had to foot an inflated bill. The 2015 campaign cost the public $443 million, which was $150 million more than the previous 2011 campaign. Mr. Speaker, no Canadian wants to be bombarded with radio and television ads all day long during a marathon campaign, especially over the 78-day marathon we just had last year. And in fact, when I was going door to door on the campaign trail, I certainly heard time and time again that people were sick and tired of such a long election, and they just could not comprehend why there was no limit to it. And it's not just me making these arguments, Mr. Speaker. This idea is also supported by our Chief Electoral Officer, someone I think that everyone in this House holds in very high regard. In his recent report to Parliament, entitled An Electoral Framework for the 21st Century, he laid out recommendations to make our electoral system fairer. He stated that not having a cap on the time for an election, the level playing field between parties can be compromised. He has recommended that there be a maximum of between 45 to 50 days, and my bill would fit perfectly within that range with a 46-day cap. So, with those reasons in mind, Mr. Speaker, I come back to the first part of my question because of all the facts I have laid out. And so I simply ask the Parliamentary Secretary for a clear answer on this. Will the government support my bill to limit the length of federal elections? Yes or no? Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague opposite from Cowichan Malahat-Langford for the bill he's put forward, and I think for the excellent arguments that he's made in proposing the bill. The bill seeks to limit the length of a writ to 46 days and to ensure that polling doesn't occur in a holiday period. And I certainly echo his concern with the implications in the last election of an extended writ period where the government, had the opportunity to elongate that campaign, give itself a spending advantage, and to take the other parties by surprise, thus making the field less even. And in the mandate letter that was given to the minister, this issue was raised. And when that issue was raised, it was also coupled with the idea of spending in the pre-writ period. Because one of the concerns that I know the member opposite would share with me is if we have a confined writ period, then there's a potential for that spending still to be on the other side of that writ period and for inequity still to exist. And so we think that those two issues should be looked at tandem, but very much support the work of the member here and look forward to him talking further on that. He's quite right to say that the Chief Electoral Officer, who I have enormous regard for, also identified this issue and the importance for it to be looked at. And that's exactly why the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs right now is looking at that report, and that's, of course, an all-party committee that is posing questions and getting information. We're also eagerly awaiting the committee's response to the Chief Electoral Officer's report. And so I think it's a question of how we get this right. I think the spirit is dead on. It's a question of what are those mechanisms to make sure that it's right and fair. And so I commend the member for introducing this bill, because I think it's at the spirit of what we need to achieve as this House. Lastly, on his the portion that is on a holiday season, I understand the intent, and I think the member is coming from the right place. I think we would just have to ensure that if there was some kind of emergency circumstance, perhaps a circumstance that I can't conceive in this moment that would necessitate an election because of a crisis in the House or something, that we would have to look at maybe making an exception in an extraordinary circumstance. But certainly it's fair to say that no member of this House would want to see an election take place over a holiday period, and certainly least of all Canadians themselves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cowichan Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly do appreciate the Parliamentary Secretary's willingness to come forward and on that. You know, I did have the honour of sitting as a member for 4 days on the Special Committee on Electoral Reform when it was doing its Atlantic Canada tour, and you know, we did hear from some of the witnesses that identified the length of election periods as an issue. I still haven't heard a yes or no answer. I'm glad to see that there's some positive commitment in that regard. But I can tell the Parliamentary Secretary that when we were drafting this bill, we certainly did throw everything we could with legislative services to see every kind of possible situation that could come up, which is why we gave that 36 to 46 day range. We thought that giving the government that 10-day range would certainly aid in whatever situation could come up. And I understand that not everything is foreseeable, but again, I certainly hope that we can get some good news out of the government in the coming months. If he's not prepared to give a yes or no now, I will certainly look forward to their response in the coming months. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, let me make it very clear to the member opposite that his bill is in absolutely the right path, and that the spirit of it is exactly what we have to achieve. To clarify, I think what we're looking at is how do we deal with that pre-writ period and some of those questions around spending limit. But those are things that I think we can work on together. And so I think that I'm very encouraged by that, and I think this bill is absolutely in the right place. I'm glad that he mentioned the other processes. I think that I look at the whole report of the Chief Electoral Officer and the need to modernize our institutions, the recommendations he gave not just on this issue but others, and I think both he and his party have been good partners in exploring how we can make this House a better place and how we can make reforms that do honour to the recommendations of the Chief Electoral Officer. So I look forward to continuing to work with the member both on this and other issues. Thank you, Mr.